Don't insult me that way.
Don't insult me that way. The words tore out of Clara May Hollis like a last breath ripped from a burning chest. Her back was pressed to the dry earth, wrists bound tight to a short post driven into the sun-baked ground. The heat pressed down on her like a hand on her throat, steady and cruel. She tilted her face away, eyes squeezed shut, because the man standing over her wore the same color cloth the churchmen wore, and she was certain he had come to finish what the others had started. Her heart hammered so hard it hurt, not from the heat alone, from the fear that this was the moment when hands would grab, when laughter would come, when dignity would be stripped away as punishment dressed up as righteousness. She had already been dragged, shouted over, named something filthy she was not. Now she waited for the next humiliation, and she could not stop shaking. The sun stood high over Prescott, Arizona territory. Summer of 1886, when mercy often hid from open ground. They hadn't done it in the middle of town. They'd dragged her just far enough outside the sheriff's easy reach, where a crowd could pretend it was nobody's job to stop them. Grass, the color of old straw, cracked under the heat. Dust clung to her skin, to the torn hem of her work dress, to the taste of fear in her mouth. She had begged earlier. Now she only breathed and waited. Boots stepped closer. Slow, measured, not hurried like the others had been. She opened her eyes just enough to see a shadow fall across her face. A wide hat blocked the sun. A man stood there, older, heavy in the shoulders, quiet in a way that did not belong to town bullies or church enforcers. But fear does not study details. Fear only remembers what it has already learned. "Don't insult me that way," she said again, voice breaking now. "If you came to shame me more, just do it and be done." The man did not answer. That silence terrified her more than shouting ever could. Silas Mercer had ridden into Prescott to sell cattle and buy medicine for a sick hand back at his ranch. He had not come looking for trouble. Trouble had been waiting for him, tied to a post and left under the sun like a warning sign. He looked at the rope first, thick, new, tied with care. Then he looked at her wrists, swollen and red, then her eyes, wide with panic, already bracing for something worse. He took off his hat and placed it over her face without a word. The shade came sudden and overwhelming. Clara gasped, not from relief, but confusion. No one had offered her shade all morning. "I'm not here for that," Silas said quietly. His voice was low, rough with years, steady as a fence post set deep. Her breath hitched. She did not believe him yet. Belief had already failed her once today. From the edge of the field came voices, angry, righteous, certain. Silas heard them too. He knew the sound of a crowd that thought it was right. He knelt and pulled a canteen from his saddle, held it close enough for her to smell clean water, waited until she nodded before tipping it to her lips. Her hands trembled so badly the rope creaked. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered. "They'll say you're with me." Silas gave a small breath that might have been a laugh once. "I've been called worse." He took out a knife. The blade flashed once in the sun. Clara sucked in air and turned her head away. Heart slamming. This was it. This was how it happened. Instead, the blade slid clean through the rope, and that was the moment he didn't stop. And that was the moment Prescott started to boil. Not when the shouting started, not when the town demanded he step aside. The tension left her wrists so fast she cried out. Her arms fell to her sides, numb and burning. She pulled the hat closer, sobbing now, not caring who heard. Silas did not rush her. He knew better than to rush a soul pulled tight to breaking. Hooves thundered closer, men shouting her name like a curse. "Go," he said, already cutting the second knot at her ankles. "Stand behind me." She staggered, legs weak, heart still racing. She stood behind him because she had no other place to stand. Men spilled out from the town road, led by a man with a church badge pinned to his chest, faces flushed, mouths twisted with anger. "What do you think you're doing?" one of them shouted. Silas stood up slow, did not raise his voice, did not step aside. "I'm stopping something that shouldn't be happening," he said. That was when the shouting really started. They called him a stranger. They called her a sinner. They called it justice. Silas did not move. He did not argue theology. He did not explain himself. He simply stayed where he was. At his feet, half buried in dust, lay a scrap of paper sealed with red wax. Stamped into it was the shape of a crow. Silas saw it and felt something old tighten in his chest. He'd seen that mark once, years ago, on papers that didn't belong to honest men. A preacher had vanished from another territory overnight, and a few families lost their land without understanding how. Silas never forgot the seal. This was not just a girl tied to a post. This was a town being steered. Clara clutched his coat from behind, voice shaking, as she whispered one question that cut deeper than the ropes ever had. "If they all believe him," she said, "what chance do I have?" And as the crowd closed in under the burning summer sun, one question hung heavier than the heat itself. Would one stubborn rancher standing his ground be enough to stop a whole town that believed it was doing God's work? The crowd did not rush them right away. It circled instead, slow and noisy. Like heat rising off the dirt, men spoke over one another, all certain, all convinced they were standing on the right side of something holy. Silas stayed where he was. One hand rested loose near his belt, not touching the gun. The other stayed open, calm, the way a man does when he's trying not to turn a bad moment into a worse one. Clara stood behind him, wrapped in his coat now, shoulders hunched, eyes fixed on the ground. She had learned that looking up invited judgment. Someone shouted that she had stolen from the church. Another said she had led good men astray. A woman near the front crossed herself and turned away, as if sin were catching. Silas listened. He always listened first. It did not take long to understand what kind of story this town had been fed. A simple one. A young woman. A missing sum of money. A preacher who spoke well and promised safety if the rot was cut out. Simple stories spread fastest in the heat. That was the part that scared Silas the most. Not the yelling, not the rope, not even the heat. It was how comfortable folks looked. Repeating a story they had not checked. A miner with dust on his sleeves kept nodding like he had been there, even though Silas could tell the man had just arrived to watch. A shopkeeper wiped his hands on his apron, eyes on Clara, like he was deciding whether she was still human. And right behind it all, Deputy Rusk drifted from face to face, quiet as smoke, making sure the right people stayed angry. Clara leaned in close enough that Silas could hear her over the crowd. She told him the missing money was not a handful of coins. It was the kind of sum that could buy a strip of land and a man a new life. She said she had seen letters once, not from any church board, but from a broker down in Phoenix. The kind who talked about survey stakes and a possible spur line like it was already written in stone. Silas had seen men lose ranches over smaller whispers than that. He looked at the church doors again and felt it plain. This was not about saving souls. This was about buying dirt cheap while folks were too scared to think. Silas finally spoke, not loud, not sharp, just enough to carry. "Where's the sheriff?" The men looked at one another. Someone pointed back toward town. No one moved to fetch him. That told Silas almost everything he needed to know. They started walking then, Silas first, Clara close behind, steps uneven, still shaky from the rope and the sun. The crowd followed, talking louder now. Anger feeding on itself. Prescott baked under the afternoon light. Wood buildings creaked. Whiskey Row smelled like dust and old drink. Windows filled with faces, curious, cautious, already choosing sides. Clara leaned closer and spoke low, afraid every word might be her last. "They say I took church money," she said. "I kept the books. I saw things didn't add up. When I asked about it, he smiled and said I worried too much." Silas nodded. He had seen that smile before, worn by men who hid behind respect. "They said you tempted him," Silas said, not as a question. She swallowed. "They say whatever makes it easier to hate me." They reached the sheriff's office. The door was closed, curtains drawn. Silas knocked once. Then again. After a long moment, Sheriff Cole stepped out, hat in hand, sweat darkening the brim. He looked tired, older than his years, like a man who had learned that peace sometimes cost more than justice. "What's this about?" the sheriff asked. eyes sliding past Clara and settling on Silas instead. Silas told it plain, a woman tied to a post, no warrant, SID, no trial. The sheriff sighed. You know how things work here. Cole didn't sound proud of it. He sounded trapped. Silas did. That was the problem. Before the sheriff could say more, the church doors opened down the street. Reverend Elias Crow stepped into the sun. He wore clean black. His Bible was tucked under his arm. He walked with purpose, like a man arriving exactly when expected. The crowd parted for him without being asked. Crow smiled, soft and sad, the way a man smiles when he believes he already owns the room. He spoke Clara's name like a prayer said for the dead. He told the sheriff that discipline had been necessary, that temptation had to be checked before it spread, that mercy without repentance was an insult to God. Silas watched the faces around him, nods, murmurs of agreement. Crow's eyes finally met Silas's, measured him, dismissed him. You're new here, Crow said, gentle as a breeze. You don't understand our ways. Silas shrugged once. I understand a rope when I see one. That did it. Crow's voice did not rise, but something sharper slid underneath it. He spoke of stolen funds, of betrayal, of how easy it was for evil to dress itself as innocence. Clara felt the ground tilt under her feet. Silas could feel the moment turning. This was not about truth. It was about control. They were ordered to leave town, to take their trouble elsewhere. The sheriff did not argue. Silas took Clara by the elbow and walked, not out of fear, out of calculation. They did not make it far. At the edge of Whiskey Row, a group of men blocked the street. Deacon Wade Larkin stood at the front, sleeves rolled, jaw tight. He smiled like a man who enjoyed his work too much. She goes back, Larkin said. And you mind your business. Silas looked at the men. Young, angry. Certain they were right. This was how it always started. Larkin's boys pushed in close, hoping the crowd would do their work for them. Silas didn't give them the show they wanted. He shifted once, shoved once, and made a narrow lane out of stubborn muscle and timing. Then he walked Clara through it, like the whole street belonged to them. The crowd exploded with noise. That was when Silas knew they were past the point of easy endings. As they backed away, Clara whispered, barely audible, He keeps papers locked away. I've seen them. Land papers, letters. I think that's why this happened. Silas did not answer right away, as his eyes were on the church, on Crow, watching from the steps, calm as ever. Somewhere in this town, the truth was being hidden behind scripture and fear. And before we go any further, if stories like this speak to you, if you enjoy slow burns and hard choices from another time, go ahead and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what comes next. Take a breath and stay with me, because what Silas does next decides everything. Silas knew one thing about towns like this. If you let them set the pace, you will always be behind. He watched the corners the way an old hand watches a nervous horse. Too many men standing where they did not belong, too many eyes that would not look away. Claire kept glancing at windows, like she expected a hand to reach out and snatch her back inside. Silas did not blame her. Fear has a memory, and it does not forget the first time it got fed. He spoke low, more to steady her than to share a plan. They needed proof that could live outside the church walls, proof a sheriff could not shrug off without losing his badge. And they needed it before Crow rang that bell again, because every time that bell sang, the town got simpler, and the preacher got stronger. Silas touched the inside pocket where he had tucked the paper with the Crow seal. A mark like that never showed up on honest business. If Crow was the same kind of man Silas remembered, tonight would not be quiet for long. Silas did not run. Running would have turned the town into a single voice shouting for blood. Instead, he walked Clara down the side street. Slow enough to look ordinary, fast enough to keep distance. Prescott felt different now. The heat was the same, but the air carried a new weight. Doors closed sooner. Eyes stayed longer. Clara kept her head down. Every step felt like another chance for someone to grab her arm and drag her back. She had lived in this town long enough to know how quickly neighbors became judges. They reached the edge of Whiskey Row where the noise thinned and the shade grew longer. Silas stopped once, just long enough to look back. Men lingered at the corners, pretending not to watch. "This town likes its stories simple," Silas said, not turning around. "You complicated it." Clara gave a breath that might have been a laugh if it had not been so tired. "I only asked where the money went." That was when Silas understood how deep the hook was set. They ducked into a narrow alley behind a feed store. Dust hung in the air like smoke. The smell of grain and sweat clung to the boards. Silas leaned a shoulder against the wall and thought, not about fists, about time. Crow would not rush. Men like him never did. They let others do the loud work. A boot scraped at the mouth of the alley. Silas straightened. Deacon Wade Larkin stepped in with two others behind him. All three wore the same look. Not angry, not scared, just sure that the town would forgive them whatever came next. Larkin spoke first, voice calm. "Reverend says you had your say." Silas nodded once. "Good, now it's my turn." Larkin smiled. He liked smiles that did not reach the eyes. Larkin stepped in like he owned the alley, and that was his mistake. Silas didn't trade punches for pride. He caught a sleeve, drove a shoulder in, and pinned one man to the boards just long enough to take the wind out of him. The second man tried to circle, but Silas turned with him, calm as a gate on good hinges. It wasn't a brawl. It was an old hand ending a problem before it grew teeth. No cheering followed, only shock. Larkin backed up a step, eyes wide now. Respect mixed with something else. Fear, maybe. Silas did not chase them when they ran. Chasing makes enemies faster. They waited until the alley went quiet again. Clara pressed her back to the boards and slid down until she was sitting. Her hands shook. Not from the heat this time. "I never wanted any of this," she said. Silas crouched a few feet away, giving her space. "Most trouble starts that way." She looked up at him then, really looked. "Those papers," she said. "They are real. I saw names, land along the creek, letters from a man who talked about surveys. He promised more if the town stayed calm." Silas frowned. "Surveyors make people nervous." "Exactly," Clara said. "So he made them angry at me instead." Silas let that settle. Anger redirected was a powerful thing. They could not stay hidden. Too many eyes, too many corners. They moved again, circling toward the quieter side of town where the houses sat farther apart and the church bell cast its long shadow. As they walked, Silas told her just enough. He had seen men like Crow before. Different names. Same tricks. Always a cause. Always a crowd. Clara listened. Each word steadied her a little more. At the edge of town, Silas stopped near a dry wash where the ground dipped and the brush grew thick. He knelt and picked up something half buried in the dirt. Red wax. Pressed into it. A crow. His jaw tightened. He did not tell her yet what it meant. Some truths work better when saved. The church bell rang once. Then again, Silas knew what that sound did to a town like that. It gathered people. It focused them. "They will come looking," Clara said. "They already are," Silas answered. He glanced toward the church where a small group was forming. Crow would speak again tonight. He would use calm words and holy language. And by morning, the town would believe it had no choice. Silas made a decision then, one he had hoped never to make again. They would not hide. They would not beg. They would not leave. They would look for proof. As they turned toward the dark line of trees near the creek, Silas wondered how many people would stand with them once the truth started to show. Because the next step meant walking straight into the place Crow guarded most, and the question waiting just ahead was simple and dangerous. What happens when a whole town believes a lie, and the only proof sits locked behind a church door? Claire stopped walking for a moment. Right there, where the shade from a cottonwood touched the dirt. She swallowed like the taste in her mouth had turned to metal. That room behind the pulpit was not just locked, it was guarded by habit. Crow went in there alone, always alone. And when he came out, he was always smiling like nothing in the world could touch him. Claire had cleaned every corner of that church, but she had never been allowed to wipe the dust off that door. The first time she asked, Crow had called it curiosity. The second time, He had called it sin, and after that, she had started to feel eyes on her back, even when no one was speaking. Silas listened, and he could hear something else now, not just fear. He could hear the shape of a trap. A man like Crow did not build a throne without protecting the boards under his feet. If Silas and Clara went in and got caught, the town would not call it proof. They would call it theft. They would call it violence. They would call it a reason to finish what the rope had started. Silas looked at the church roof line in the fading light and felt his stomach go hard. The bell rope was still, but it would not stay still for long. He told Clara to breathe, because once they stepped through that door, there would be no clean way back. The church sat quiet at dusk, the kind of quiet that came before something loud. Windows glowed soft with lamplight. The bell rope hung still, waiting for the next pull. Silas and Clara did not approach from the front. They came from the side, where the ground dipped and the brush grew thick. Cicadas buzzed in the heat. Sweat ran slow down Silas's back. Clara led the way. She moved like someone who knew every board and step. She had scrubbed these floors. She had counted these chairs. She knew where the light did not reach. The door at the rear opened without a sound. Clara had kept the key hidden long ago. Not for this, but because she trusted herself more than promises. And lately, she'd felt eyes on her back every time she walked past that door. Inside, the air smelled of old wood and lamp oil. Silas paused, listening. Nothing but the hum of summer and his own breath. They moved toward the small room behind the pulpit. The one Crow kept locked. The one Clara had never been allowed to clean. Her hands shook as she fit the key. Not fear alone, anger too. The lock turned. Inside were shelves and a desk. On the desk sat stacks of paper, neat and careful. Too careful. Silas closed the door behind them. They worked fast. Clara knew what she was looking for. Ledgers with numbers that skipped, letters folded too many times, names that did not belong to church business. Silas watched the door while she read. Her breath caught. She slid one paper across the desk. Land descriptions, creek lines, survey markers, promises of payment once certain conditions were met. "This is it," she whispered. "This is why." Silas nodded. He felt that old tightening in his chest again, the same feeling he had felt years ago when truth brushed too close to power. A sound came from the hall. Footsteps. Silas turned just as the door flew open. Light spilled in. Voices followed. Deacon Larkin stood there, face red, eyes bright. Deputy Rusk behind him, hand resting near his gun. Crow stepped in last, calm, almost gentle. Silas knew then it had never been a hiding place. It had been bait. Crow looked at the papers on the desk and smiled softly. "Thieves caught with the good," he said. "How sad." Clara backed away, heart pounding. "These are church papers," she said. "I had every right." Crow shook his head. "You had trust," he said, "and you broke it." He turned to the deputy. "Take her." Rusk moved. Silas stepped between them. For a moment, the room balanced on a knife edge. Silas didn't want to draw his gun. Drawing it would make Crow right in the eyes of the town. But Crow knew that too. "See how he stands," Crow said, voice rising just enough to carry. "See how violence follows him." Silas made a choice. He moved, not toward Crow, toward the window. The room exploded into motion. A chair tipped. Papers flew. Silas grabbed Clara's wrist and shoved the window open with his shoulder. Glass shattered outward into the dark, in the confusion. Nobody knew which way they'd hit the ground. They were gone before the deputy could react. They hit the ground hard and ran. Behind them, bells rang. Crow did not chase. He did not need to. The whole town would do it for him. They ran until the lights thinned and the ground turned rough, past fences, past sleeping cattle, into the broken stone and scrub of the granite dells. Clara stumbled once and Silas caught her, held her until her breathing slowed. "They will say I stole," she said, voice hollow. "They'll spin any yarn to keep their hands clean," Silas answered. They hid among the rocks as torches flickered in the distance. Shouts carried on the wind. Silas checked the papers he had grabbed in the rush. Not all of them, just enough. One letter stood out. A name was scratched out, then written again, like a man trying to bury his own past, and the red wax seal was the same Crow Silas had seen long ago. Silas felt a cold clarity settle in. Crow was not who he said he was. Not now. Not before. Clara watched Silas's face change. "What is it?" she asked. "Trouble with a long memory," he said. They could not go back to town tonight. Crow had set the story and stolen papers. A violent outsider, a fallen woman. The town would sleep believing it. Silas looked toward the dark line of trees by the creek. There were people there who did not kneel to Crow, people who had given money and asked questions later. They moved again, slower now, careful with each step. Behind them, Prescott settled into a restless night. Doors barred, lanterns burned late, and inside the church, Reverend Crow prepared his sermon. By morning, the town would gather, and this time he would not settle for ropes and shame, because when lies begin to slip, men like Crow do not tighten their grip. They call for judgment. And as Silas and Clara disappeared into the dark, one truth pressed hard against the night. The next sunrise would decide whether this town chose justice or blood. Night settled heavy over the granite dells. Not quiet, just still enough to hear your own thoughts whether you wanted to or not. Silas and Clara stayed low among the rocks while the town searched itself tired. Torches drifted like slow fireflies along the ridges, then thinned, then vanished one by one. People always grew brave in crowds and weary alone. When the last light disappeared, Silas let himself breathe. They moved deeper into the stone, following a narrow cut where the ground dipped toward Lynx Creek. Water meant cover. Water meant time. Clara walked without speaking. Her strength surprised Silas, not because she was fearless, but because fear had not stopped her. It had only sharpened her. They rested near the creek where cottonwoods leaned close and the air cooled just enough to matter. Clara drank like she hadn't tasted water in a lifetime. Silas checked the papers again under moonlight filtered through leaves. Numbers lined up too clean, names repeated where they should not. And that crossed-out name returned again, like a scar that never healed. He told her then, not all of it, but enough. Years ago, far from Prescott, Silas had worked a case where a churchman vanished overnight. Money gone, land deeds altered, a new name appeared 2 towns over. Preaching harder than ever, men like that did not disappear. They only moved. Clara listened, arms wrapped around her knees. "So he planned this," she said. "Not just me." Silas nodded. "You were in the way." That truth sat heavier than the night. Before dawn, they found the woman Silas had hoped for. Mrs. Alden lived alone near the creek, a widow with a spine made of iron and grief long settled. She had given more money to the church than anyone else in town. Silas knocked once, then waited. Mrs. Alden opened the door with a lantern in hand and no fear in her eyes. She knew Silas by reputation. She knew Crow by instinct. Inside, she poured coffee without being asked. She listened without interrupting. When Clara finished, Mrs. Alden stood and went to a small trunk beneath her bed. From it, she pulled a folded paper, edges worn thin. "I kept this because something felt wrong," she said. A receipt with the wrong name. The name matched the crossed-out one. Silas felt the pieces settle. They did not stay long. Daylight was coming. As they left, Mrs. Alden said one last thing. "They will not thank you for this." Silas smiled faintly. "That's not why we're doing it." By mid-morning, Prescott was already buzzing. Word had spread that judgment would be held at the courthouse plaza. Not a trial, a reckoning. Silas and Clara watched from the edge of town as people gathered. Men cleaned their boots. Women whispered prayers. Children sensed something important and wrong. Clara's hands shook again. "If I stand there," she said, "they will see what he told them to see." Silas looked at her. "They will see what you show them." He told her the plan. Simple, dangerous, and public. They waited until the plaza filled and the sun climbed high enough to make patience short. Crow stood near the courthouse steps, Bible open, voice calm and steady. He spoke of order, of rot, of the price of mercy when it went unchecked. Silas watched the sheriff. Cole stood stiff, eyes tired, caught between law and livelihood. The moment came quietly. Silas stepped forward. The crowd stirred, murmurs spread. Crow paused, smiled. Silas did not shout. He did not accuse. He held up the papers and spoke like a man explaining a ledger. Not a sin. He named numbers. He named dates. He named land. People leaned in despite themselves. Crow tried to interrupt, but questions began to surface. A farmer recognized his parcel. A widow remembered a promise. The crowd shifted. Anger cracked. Confusion leaked through. Not everyone softened. A few men pushed forward, hungry for a quick ending. A few women clutched their Bibles tighter, as if paper could erase numbers. The sheriff had to raise both hands just to keep it from turning into a hanging. For a moment, it felt like the town might choose violence simply because it was familiar. Clara stepped forward then, not trembling now. Standing tall, she did not beg. She did not cry. She spoke of keeping books, of missing sums, of being told to stay quiet. Someone shouted for proof. Mrs. Alden's voice cut through the noise, clear, unafraid. She held up the receipt. Deputy Rusk looked away. The sheriff stepped forward slowly. He took the papers, read them. Crow's calm finally slipped. He spoke louder now, sharper. Silas saw it then, the moment when belief began to rot. Crow tried to leave. Hands reached out, not violent, just firm. The crowd did not need Silas anymore. That was the most dangerous part. Silas moved beside Clara, close enough that she felt steady. This was the point where truth could turn into something ugly if pushed too hard. The sheriff raised his voice. For the first time all morning, people listened. Crow was taken aside, not enchained. Not yet, but the sheriff didn't let him walk back to the pulpit. The crowd buzzed, uncertain what to do with its anger, now that it had nowhere clean to land. Clara let out a breath she did not know she'd been holding for days. Silas watched her and felt something settle in him too, but he also knew something else. Men like Crow did not surrender quietly. As the sun burned overhead and the plaza argued with itself, Silas noticed Crow speaking low to someone near the edge. A look passed between them. Silas felt that old, tightening return, because the truth had come out. But the danger was not finished choosing its shape. And as the sheriff turned back toward the crowd, one final question waited just ahead. What does a cornered man do when he realizes belief alone will no longer save him? The plaza did not erupt the way people expected. It did not explode into cheers or violence. It breathed. Men shifted their weight. Women loosened their hands from prayer. The sound that followed was not anger, but something quieter and harder to base. Uncertainty. Reverend Crow stood apart now, smaller without the echo of easy belief holding him up, but Silas could see it in a few faces. Some folks still wanted to believe him, because admitting they were wrong hurt worse than any sermon. No rope was raised. No sermon finished the day. Sometimes justice doesn't come in with thunder. Sometimes it's just one person refusing to turn their head. Silas stayed where he was. He did not claim victory. He did not seek thanks. He watched the town learn what it felt like to doubt itself. Clara stood beside him, shoulders straight, eyes clear. She was not forgiven by everyone. Not. That kind of healing takes longer than truth, but she was no longer alone. When the crowd thinned and the sun began to lean west, the sheriff approached. He spoke quietly. There would be questions. There would be paperwork. There would be time. Time was the thing Clara had almost lost. They walked out of town together as the light softened and the heat finally loosened its grip. No escort, no applause, just the sound of boots on dirt and cicadas waking up again. At the edge of Prescott, Silas stopped. He looked back once at the buildings, the church, the plaza where belief had nearly swallowed a life. This place will remember. he said, "even if it pretends not to." Clara nodded. "I will too." They rode toward the ranch as evening settled in. The land opened up. Breath came easier on the trail. Silas spoke less about what had happened and more about what came next. Work, quiet mornings, a chance to be known for who you are, not what someone says you are. Clara listened and imagined a life not measured by fear. This is where the story slows down, and this is where it matters most, because the real lesson was never about Crow. It was about the town, and it was about us. Most of us will never face a rope or a crowd in the heat of an Arizona summer. But many of us have stood in rooms where silence felt safer than truth. Many of us have watched someone be judged and felt the pull to look away. Silas did not stop because he was brave. He stopped because he had learned what happens when you do not. He had seen how easy it is to let stories do the thinking for us, how comforting it feels to believe the loudest voice, how dangerous it is to confuse certainty with goodness. Clara survived because she held on to herself when others tried to name her. She did not become what they said she was. She waited for the right moment to stand. That matters. It matters when you're at work and someone is being blamed to keep peace. It matters in families when silence feels easier than honesty. It matters when fear asks you to trade your values for comfort. Ask yourself this. When the room leans one way, which way do you lean? Toward truth or toward quiet? Another lesson sits right beside it. Belief is powerful, so is doubt. Crow did not fall because someone shouted louder. He fell because small questions were finally allowed to exist. A number that did not add up, a name that did not belong, a widow who trusted her gut. Progress often begins there, not with anger, with curiosity. And there is one more thing worth holding on to. Redemption does not always look like forgiveness. Sometimes it looks like distance. Sometimes it looks like starting over somewhere new. Silas did not ask the town to change overnight. He simply refused to let it break someone he cared about. That kind of strength is quiet. It lasts. Here's the hard truth. A lie doesn't die the moment you expose it. It lingers in pride, in fear, in folks who'd rather stay certain than stay honest. That's why the brave thing is not winning. The brave thing is staying steady. As they reached the ranch and the first stars came out, Clara felt something unfamiliar settle in her chest. Not relief, not joy, possibility. And if you're listening to this right now, wherever you are, maybe that is what you need most. Not a perfect ending, but the sense that tomorrow can be shaped by what you choose today. So here's the question I want to leave you with. If you had been standing in that plaza, would you have followed the crowd, or would you have waited long enough to ask one honest question? If stories like this help you think about your own choices, go ahead and tap like. It tells me this kind of story matters to you. And if you want more slow burn stories about courage, consequences, and quiet strength, subscribe to the channel so you do not miss the next one. Now take a breath. Look around where you are. What time is it right now? And where are you listening from? Because no matter the year or the place, the choice to stand for what is right always belongs to the person listening.